Okay, thanks to both. I think my question could be for both of you. I was wondering, would it be easier to adapt the VAT on the food products instead of taxing before for the production? So taxing the end product instead of taxing the producer.
That was actually one of the options I had on the slide. I skipped over because I realized I was going beyond my time. Okay. Yeah, that was one of the options I had on the slide I skipped over. An important point to make is that actually a consumption tax, effectively what you're suggesting, in itself still doesn't avoid leakage. Because some of the production that otherwise would have been sold on the domestic market is now simply diverted to the export market. So you still have a leakage problem, but as I say, you have leakage with any climate action. We shouldn't be afraid of leakage. It's a question of deciding what is the level of leakage that we can live with. More generally, there are other issues with placing the revenue, the tax on the retail, on the consumer price. In a sense, the further away you are from where the emissions originate, the more difficult it is to get accurate measurement. So the great benefit of placing the point of obligation on the farm, despite all the difficulties which Stéphane rightly highlighted, the huge number of farms, the transactions costs and so on. But the great advantage is that you are in a much better position to actually recognize what those farmers' emissions are. And also that farmer has a much greater incentive to actually take steps to mitigate those. Whereas if you put it on the consumer end, yeah, it becomes much more diffuse along the chain, and you don't get the same incentive effects. So it's much less efficient, apart from the fact that you also don't avoid the leakage. But Stéphane, I'm sure you have.
No, I totally agree with that. That's also one part that I skipped in my presentation. And I would add to what you said is that you don't emit when you eat, right? You emit because you produce food, right? And that's exactly what you said. You have to put the incentives the closer possible to the source of emissions. So if you put it on the end consumers, that's somewhere you assume that somehow the incentives will be passed back to the producers to change their practices. So that involves to reflect in the tax you put at the consumer level to reflect the heterogeneity in the production process at the beginning of the chain, right? And that's very difficult to do because when you have a steak on the shelf of the supermarket, it's very difficult to track exactly how it has been produced, in what condition, with what kind of animal feeding. So what you have in the end is just an average of the emissions that are used to produce. So you don't pass the incentive to change the production process if you go to the consumer end. But that does the advantage to treat all the products wherever they come from the same way. So that has some appeal. But you lose some of the incentives because, as you said, you're further away from the point where you have the real issue, which is the emissions linked to the production process. Yeah, there was one.
I wanted to come back to a question that was addressed to you, Stéphane, because we discussed that at lunchtime. It is about the carbon certification removal that is being developed by the Commission. So you were asked whether it was good or not, and I fully agree with you that it's really good to regulate this business area, because some schemes are just selling dreams. So it will have negative feedback on the system, but still it's what is needed, in fact, is quite elaborated MRV system. So my concern, my worry is whether it will not have negative feedbacks because administrative burden on the farmer and because MRV has a cost. So the revenue for the farmer will decrease. Will it be still appealing? What is your, we discussed that at lunch, what is your perception of that?
I'm not sure I have a definite answer to that question, but I'm sure what's important is that there is a trade-off between the cost of MRV and the accuracy you impose on the MRV systems to produce precise and accurate numbers for sequestration and reductions in emissions. This has a cost, and there is a trade-off to be found with the options to reduce the emissions. So when you say that, that means that you have some kind of interior solutions between the two. I know that's a kind of a lame answer, but that's for sure. If I put that differently, for sure, I would not be in favor of the most accurate and very sophisticated with many satellites going over your farm twice a day or whatever, but at a huge cost, and that would be of no use in terms of emissions, because especially in a voluntary system, nobody would adopt such a scheme because it's too expensive, and we would end up with no effort at all and no environmental effect at all. So there is a trade-off there that we have to live with. I don't know if you have another take on that.
I mean, just a comment on the Danish case, because they are going to introduce a carbon tax. And from what I can understand, I live in Copenhagen these days. So what I can understand is that actually Danish farmers are already linked into accounting systems and the provision of data to their ministry in a way probably that is not the case in all European countries. So they've had heavy nitrogen fertilizer regulation for 2 decades. So their use of nitrogen is very closely linked. There's sort of limits. Obviously, there are animal numbers and types and so on. And one of the things which is important to bear in mind in this MRV issue is that, of course, it will always only be approximate. But the point is that going for greater complexity is of absolutely no benefit if you cannot get it recognized in the national inventories. The national inventories set the legal targets. That's where fines on member states will begin to roll in if we are exceeding our effort sharing directive target, for example, or we are not hitting our LULUCF targets. So our national inventories are key. And the national inventories are actually designed in a very simple way. It's the level of activity multiplied by an emissions factor. And I think somebody talked about the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Sorry, you did it. So basically, it's a question of making sure that your inventory is sufficiently granulated. So obviously your animal numbers are divided into age classes, and maybe even into breeds, maybe even to how they're managed and so on. The more granularity you can get in, the more accurate you can track. But the Danes seem to think that they can do it with very little additional. I heard a presentation by somebody from their Ministry of Finance on Tuesday, and they say all of the data they need are available, but they're not in a uniform data center. It's getting the different systems to talk together. And he didn't underestimate the problem of that, but it is an IT issue rather than what the farmer is required to provide. So I was encouraged by that.
I, 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 I,
Hi, thank you. I'm Louise Chevalier from the Agronomy Institute of Rennes. I just have trouble getting around what it means in the fields, taxing carbon, because does it necessarily mean that the agricultural production system will change towards a more sustainable one? Or is it a question of just level of cost of carbon to ensure that the wealthiest farms can't be well, we have the money to pay the taxes, and can't we just maybe target directly the practices that pollute more to reduce the carbon emission and not, I don't know, the other way around? Thank you.
Yes, I'm trying to see where I start in the answer. In terms of what you said about going to less emissions or practices with less emissions towards more sustainable, that you use something like that. Maybe just a caveat there, because what I showed and what we've discussed today was mainly targeted towards greenhouse gas emissions. And although there can be synergies, as Claire mentioned, there might be also trade-offs with other environmental aspects, and especially when it comes to the livestock sectors. The livestock sector, especially in terms of animal feeding, what is good for greenhouse gas emissions in the livestock sector is not necessarily good for other dimensions of sustainability. So that's one, in your question, that's one aspect that maybe where there might be a caveat there. And sorry, I lost the question you had at the end. Can you?
Maybe just, should we make a really big cost of carbon to ensure that farms really get involved? Or shouldn't we target directly the practices that pollute more?
But when you say the practices, you mean maybe when you say the practices, you mean impose some practices to the farmers, and because at the end you have to provide the incentives for the farmers to adopt some practices that are better off. So again, the price is based on the reduction of emissions that you anticipate from the level of activities times or differentiated by type of practices. And that was the issue discussed before by Alan in the inventories, that we have to get the granularities to reflect that. But once it's reflected, actually the instrument does provide the incentives to go to those practices. I'm not sure I answered your question perfectly, but...
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, if we look at the debate around the subsidies paid under the Common Agricultural Policy at the present time, one of the big debates is trying to move actually away from these action-based payments, sort of paying farmers for undertaking specific practices, which we hope then will give us the desired outcome, whether it's biodiversity or climate, and moving more towards result-based systems. So in a sense, the carbon tax fits more in with the sort of result-based approach. But I would think that, and I think that also came up in an earlier session today, that I think maybe it was Marc who mentioned it, that yes, economists are very sort of keen on a carbon price, but I think we would all recognize that a carbon price alone is never sufficient. And of course, if you want to incentivize farmers to undertake certain practices, then that probably has to be a subsidy approach rather than a market-based. It's hard to see a tax on you know, that if you don't have cover crops, we're going to actually tax you. But you can certainly see that, you know, we will subsidize you to introduce a cover crop. And in terms of this sort of synergy issue, which has come up earlier, maybe I can digress a little bit and again just talk about the Danish example, because what Denmark is doing is precisely what you have suggested as an action-based measure. So they are going to regulate that farmers have got to, livestock farmers, well, specifically dairy farmers, have got to feed their dairy cows with Bovaer, this methane-reducing feed additive, for at least 3 months in the year. And that will be a legal requirement. If you want to be a dairy farmer, you have to keep your cattle are indoors for 3 months, and you have to feed them this Bovaer. And they are going to give a subsidy to the farmer because it costs about €100 per cow to do that. So they will actually subsidize that practice. So it will be a legal obligation, but there will be a subsidy. Now, interesting, they are saying that if a farmer wants to extend that feeding period, then the animals must be kept indoor all year round. Okay? So even if you want to extend it to, and why would you want to extend it? Because of course, if you reduce your methane emissions, you're going to pay less in the carbon tax. Because the carbon tax will be a complement, so the two will work together. So there may be some farmers who will say, okay, I don't get the subsidy, but I'm actually going to avoid having to pay the tax. But what the government is saying that if you do that, you actually have to keep all your animals indoors. Now, about 3/4 of all dairy cows never see any grass in Denmark anyway. But you can imagine the outcry from the animal welfare groups who are saying this is absolutely terrible that you're now requiring all animals to be kept indoors, except the ecological, the organic farmers. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
So maybe an economic last question, or just showing my ignorance. So as a biologist, I've learned today that there are many smart models that can be constructed to have proposals that are expressed. And I'm a trusting scientist, although this is not at all my specialty. Now, I have a question, though. It seems to be hard to convince policymakers, for example, to adopt certain of these proposals. How confident are you that your models are actually correct? In other words, are all the right elements identified, correctly modeled? How sensitive are they to unpredicted perturbations? Another way to answer my question is models that have been conceived 20, 15 years ago and that have actually been implemented. Do they always, or in what fraction, lead to what you had modeled would indeed happen? Is the difficulty to convince the policymakers also a lack of trust?
Trust on the modeling side? Okay. Is there an uncertainty on the modeling results that all of the models, and not necessarily, of course there is. Is the uncertainty more on the, there was some kind of discussion this morning about that. Is the uncertainty comes more from the economic side of it or the biological side of it? Claire was implying that it was coming more from the economic side. Having seen some of the models used for carbon sequestration over time, that's not a critique of the models themselves, but I see that there is a lot of uncertainty as well in this area. So it's not always the economists' fault. Okay, so that's one part. And in terms of calibration, I must say that and validation, it's much more difficult than using, because we don't have access to experimental conditions for most of the mechanisms we produce. So, of course, this is much more challenging, and it comes in the discussion with you know, maybe lack of trust, as you put it, from the policymakers sometimes. That said, it remains that the mechanisms at play are there, and the models reproduce some of the main salient features of the behavior we observe. At least they are done to reflect that. Of course, there are rooms for improvement. There are data problems. There are the lack of you know, experimental conditions that we can use to calibrate the models, and there is improvement in this area as well. But yeah, of course, there are changes there.
Yeah, it's a great question. We always react very defensively, of course, once our toolbox is criticized. Yeah, Stéphane has mentioned the lack of experimental evidence for much of the economic modeling. I mean, there are ways in which we can try and get around that. We would always do sensitivity analysis around some of the key parameters so that you get a sense of, you know, whether the results change dramatically or not. It's difficult to do ex post validation because so much else has changed. I mean, your models usually are just looking at one specific policy intervention, and but the real world, of course, will change in many other ways. If I'm a little bit cynical, I think at the end of the day, the policymakers are not actually going to turn down a policy because they don't trust the model. I think it's whether they like the results or not. I agree with that.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I'm Anita Van Queen from INS. I've got quite a naive question. So if I understood well, your message about carbon leakage was that it's not about avoiding carbon leakage, but about fixing which amount of carbon leakage we can accept. But given that the estimations ranges from -5% to more than 100%, like I don't figure out how, to what extent this uncertainty could be a problem if we imagine a world where BCAMs were to be applied. Like, will this uncertainty be a problem, or isn't it like significant?
Well, first of all, I'm really delighted because you did pick up the key message absolutely the way I wanted to get it across. So I'm very pleased about that. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, this carbon leakage debate is probably going to take place prior to the introduction of the BCAM, because it's going to be the issue that is raised around whether we actually move ahead with a market-based incentive in agriculture in the first place. And it's there that, I mean, I see it already at home in Ireland. 90% of our agricultural area is grassland, and 80% of our production is livestock. And ruminant livestock at that. So we are very vulnerable to any kind of tax on emissions from livestock. And you know, the big argument is that okay, if we are going to reduce our beef production here in Ireland, that is simply going to lead to increased beef production in Brazil and deforestation, and it's going to be double the emissions that we can do it here. So you can immediately see that if you remember that slide where I showed the deconstruction of the leakage rate, the relative intensity issue is important, but it's only one of the steps, and yet it's the one that because it's very obvious to make that comparison. It's easy to understand. So that's the one that people pick on. What they neglect is that we're going to get, and hopefully over time as the research develops new techniques, we're going to get quite a lot of mitigation through technical means. So it's not all just in terms of reducing production. There are these general equilibrium effects, although I do find that the Danish study puts those much higher than I would expect them to be. You do have demand effects, which can be important. So all of those factors tend to reduce the leakage you would get from making the more extreme assumptions. So yes, I do think that it is going to be a really useful service of the economics, agricultural economics profession to try to narrow that range of estimates so that we actually can inform that debate in a more realistic sense. I mean, if I show you that table, we can't really say anything sensible at the moment that would either convince farmers or policymakers that there is or isn't an issue. So we do need to invest more resources into that.
Thank you very much.
Do you think there is a... you define carbon leakage only with respect to climate regulation in a country or in a group of country. Do you think there is some logic from an economic point of view to extend the concept to all regulation? Because take the example of the EU. As you know better than me, there is couple support to livestock, to cattle. So you have increase in productivity, more production in the EU, less import from third country. So you can say, from an EU point of view, that you have reduced, in fact, greenhouse gas emission in foreign country, and you can claim a credit on the world scene. I disagree with that, but you can defend this position.
Yeah,
I don't know. That goes with the CO2 price equivalent of all the policy instrument that you mentioned as well. That could be put in that debate also, where we can translate all policy instruments into their carbon equivalent price or something like that.
Yeah, I interpreted your question, Hervé, maybe slightly differently in the sense that you're saying, look, we are carbon efficient producers in Europe. We have a low emissions per unit of output compared to the rest of the world, or at least compared to the export markets where we sell our beef or dairy products. So are we not doing the world a service by increasing our production in Europe and displacing some of this high emission production in the rest of the world? That's how I interpreted the argument. Well, the first point, of course, is that we do know that at least in certain hotspots in Europe, that our existing level of production, particularly of livestock products, I'm thinking of the Netherlands, I might even think of Brittany, already exceeds, some of the local planetary boundaries. So in terms of ammonia, water pollution, nitrogen recycling, and so on. So to suggest that we might want to sort of in some sense help the climate by imposing even additional costs on our own societies, perhaps isn't the most sensible approach to make. I also think that if that's the argument that would be made, that basically we want to try to reduce emissions in third countries, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to displace your exports and your livelihoods. I would say that particularly if we are inducing the increased production in Europe through coupled payments, so through subsidy, I would sort of say that a much more effective use of that money would be to actually give it directly to those countries and help them to improve their own efficiency or to introduce better enforcement of their land and forest legislation so that they reduce their rate of deforestation and so on. So, it's an interesting argument, but I think if I were to deconstruct it, I think it would not be something that would appeal to me. Yeah.
Pierre Barret. I was wondering, because apparently the price of the CO2 ton in the agricultural sector is cheaper compared to some other sector, but it's not implemented. So does it mean that if the subsidies would be higher, so that the price of the ton in the agricultural sector would increase, it could be implemented? In other words, maybe it's because it's too cheap, and we have to consider that it should be more expensive to be accepted by the sector. I don't know if it's clear, but
no, I'm not sure to get the end of the question. But what's sure is that what I was showing is with the current targets for the agriculture sector in France, in this case, but that's the same with Europe. And the targets for this sector in the SNBC are kind of much less demanding than for the other sectors, right? Because the agricultural sector has to divide by 2 its emissions, where the other sectors have to cut them by a factor of 10 or something like that. So if you take that into account and you look at by how much the sector can reduce its emissions, then you can see that the cost of reducing these emissions is lower in agriculture than in existing sectors. So what do you take from that? You can say, okay, maybe the effort that this sector can put or can provide can be a bit higher, can be pushed a little bit. So that would save very costly efforts in the other sectors, and then in the end, the society wins. So I don't know if that was your question, but actually that was the idea of the graph I showed. And maybe that was not your question.
Yeah, maybe my question is very clear in my head, but the idea is that if it's not implemented, maybe it's because we consider it too cheap compared to what it should be or to be implemented by the actors. So what is deciding the price of this ton? Because I think the sector is not buying.
No, here the estimates I was showing is just how much it would cost to reduce by this amount. So it's not a price that they pay right now. So your question is why isn't it implemented right now? I think that's for political economy reasons related to the structure of the sector. The importance in the electoral systems of the rural areas, maybe something like that may play a role rather than other considerations.
Or maybe because you are talking about the economic price of the ton, and I'm talking about the socio-economic price of the ton. So maybe you have to pay more to have it avoided. And then it means that depending on the sector, you may have to pay more or less depending on with who you are negotiating.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure.
Hello, thanks. I'm Sarah Huet from the INRAE. Many thanks for both your talks. I have two different questions. The first one is more related to my own work because I'm working with the farm accountancy data network. So you might know this. And I was thinking about the link we can make with this data network with the MRV system. Do you think using those huge data sets that are collected from, I think, more than 15 or 20 years, do you think it can help build a uniformized and really homogeneous MRV system with a really fine granularity? And my second question is, maybe I missed the information, but I think we only talk about taxing carbon and that polluters, payers, and everything. I didn't heard, or I don't think you talked about taxing suppliers, farmer suppliers. Why, for instance, don't we tax holdings that sell mineral nitrogen fertilizer to farmers? Because we know mineral nitrogen produce greenhouse gas, and or, for instance, pesticides about biodiversity, which impact biodiversity. Maybe we could tax farmer suppliers before taxing the farmers.
On the second part of the, for the nitrogen fertilizer, for instance, industry, they are already included in the ETS sector in terms, so they have allowances, so they have to pay, if they are based in Europe, they have to pay for their emissions. So that's not a tax per se, but they have they face the price of their emission, at least as it is reflected on the ETS market, and it's also included in the BCAM instrument for producers outside of the EU. For pesticides, that's another issue because it's less related to greenhouse gas emissions. But so in terms of inputs, some of it actually is already affected by a carbon price, sort of. For the first part of your question, that's the relationship with the possibility to use existing statistical instruments like FADN, right, to improve the MRV system. I mean, that's very important that we have a statistical apparatus that reflects with the finest possible granularity the processes that are behind the emissions. So I know that there is an initiative in Ireland. I saw a presentation last year in Rennes about that, where you could have in the Irish FADN, you already have an accounting of the emissions at the farm level, and then it all depends on the granularity and the choice of both the activity variables and the emission factors that are used and how they reflect the heterogeneity in the practices. But of course, that would be a great thing. I don't know if you want
to. We were talking earlier that there is now a huge amount of data becoming available, and I mean, I would even think beyond the FADN database, which of course is official, but there are many apps out there now which farmers can use to count their carbon which are promoted by private suppliers, or the co-ops, dairy co-ops may be requiring their suppliers to use these. That's certainly the case in Ireland. So actually, there's a lot of farmers who are already beginning to collect information, and I thought it was a very interesting point in Hugo Vellin's presentation, where he was describing the system that had been proposed in Europe, in New Zealand, which has now been parked, if you like. But there had been this transition in the early 2 years, where know your footprint, or know your carbon was actually getting the farmers to actually count their carbon and to be aware of what their total emissions were, played a very important role. So my sense is that if we were to move in this direction now, there may be some thresholds, in the sense that we're only going to include the larger farms in this, but in principle that information should then become available, almost for every farmer who is covered, and so not just the fattened database. So I would have thought that will give great scope for, if that data is made available to researchers, it would give a huge scope for interesting studies to be done. So what I'm saying is that the fattened database is the obvious official one at the moment, but if indeed we were to extend this, there could be a lot more farmers who are able to provide this information. On the other question, why not impose the point of obligation at a different point than just the farmers? And I would make perhaps just 2 comments on that, because there is a real debate to be had around that issue, and it's to do with the effectiveness of the tax, because again, the more you move away from the farm level, the less direct incentive there is to actually change your behavior. Because you can't, if every ton of fertilizer that you buy includes that tax, then the fact that you might apply your fertilizer using a low emissions system, or precision variable rate technologies, or whatever the management system might be, and that you're actually making, to the extent that you make less use of your fertilizer as a result of those technologies, of course you will benefit because you're buying less fertilizer. But to the extent that you're actually able to reduce your emissions per unit of mineral fertilizer used, you're not going to get any benefit from that. Whereas if it was a farm level system, potentially you could, if it was granular enough. But the objection is, of course, that you have many more points of obligation. If you put it at the farm level, you only have a small handful of fertilizer manufacturers and distributors and importers. So you would certainly lower the transaction costs of if you were to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this exchange.
seront... Les vidéos et les enregistrements seront disponibles sur le site de FairCarboN à une certaine échéance. Et par ailleurs, nous avons, Stéphane et moi, mobilisé des groupes d'étudiants, respectivement du master économie de l'environnement et des transports de Paris-Saclay et de la spécialisation agroéconomie et politique publique de l'Institut Agro Rennes-Angers, pour travailler pour faire des comptes rendus des interventions du jour, et peut-être plus si on y arrive. Et donc là aussi, ce seront des produits dérivés de cette journée qui seront, je l'espère, disponibles dans un délai pas rapide, mais raisonnable, sur le site de FairCarboN d'ici quelques semaines. Voilà. Et ce que j'espère, c'est que ça donnera l'occasion de chacun de poursuivre ses réflexions, de poser d'autres questions. Ce que je pourrais juste partager avec vous, c'est pas du tout exhaustif et forcément non objectif non plus, hein, mais il me semble que parmi tout ce qui a été dit aujourd'hui, il y a vraiment beaucoup de choses. Il y a un certain nombre de points qui sont revenus à plusieurs titres que j'aimerais partager avec vous. L'importance de la dimension temporelle dans la mise en œuvre face aux urgences et l'importance d'intervenir dans le secteur agricole rapidement pour être en mesure simplement d'atteindre les objectifs de l'accord de Paris. Mais cette dimension temporelle joue aussi, on l'a vu avec les interventions de ce matin notamment, sur la question de comment on calcule la rentabilité économique d'investissement qui serait nécessaire pour faire ces transformations, ce qui pose la question de savoir justement de quel horizon temporel on parle et comment on aligne les nécessaires temporalités techniques à celles qui sont du changement social. L'importance de partager l'état des connaissances en sciences sociales et en sciences biophysiques pour dépasser autant que possible les incertitudes. Et on voit, et on a vu à plusieurs reprises et dans différents domaines aujourd'hui, combien l'importance de l'incertitude joue négativement et sur le changement de pratique et sur la prise de décision et alimente tous les arguments pour ne pas bouger. Donc, si on peut continuer par la recherche et les études à limiter cette incertitude et connaître de plus en plus de choses, ça ne peut que contribuer à atteindre les objectifs fixés. On peut être, c'est mon troisième point, on peut être un peu pris de vertige par l'écart entre la trajectoire observée et puis de l'autre, le potentiel biophysique et aussi d'ailleurs des outils de politique publique qui pourraient intervenir et qui, a priori, du point de vue économique, devraient être parfaitement efficaces pour permettre les incitations et pour des changements de pratiques qui permettraient de réduire les émissions nettes de gaz à effet de serre dans le secteur agricole. On a vu que ce gap, cet écart, s'explique sans doute, même si on ne l'a pas traité aujourd'hui, mais on l'a évoqué, par la difficulté des acteurs à accepter, voire à souhaiter changer de comportement, qu'il s'agisse de freins socioculturels, idéologiques ou relevant d'intérêts économiques actuels bien compris. Donc, c'est ce qu'on a sous-entendu par nos questions d'économie politique, hein, qui prend les décisions et qui exerce une influence sur les trajectoires choisies par les décideurs. C'est tout à fait en lien avec les points précédents évoqués, c'est-à-dire l'incertitude, l'incertitude notamment en particulier des perdants potentiels de tout changement. Accepter de perdre, comment peut-on être compensé? Voilà, ça c'est sûr que l'incertitude des perdants est un frein énorme à au changement et aux prises de décision. Et puis la dimension temporelle, puisqu'elle diffère malheureusement, et il faudrait l'aligner, entre les agendas de gestion annuelle d'une entreprise, d'une exploitation agricole, la durée des mandats politiques et les temps des processus biophysiques nécessaires pour l'atteinte des objectifs, et les durées d'amortissement, d'investissement financier de long terme qui suscitent des milliards de dollars. Donc, il nous reste beaucoup de travail pour voir comment on peut contribuer à réduire et aligner ces différentes dimensions. Dans le cadre de la politique agricole commune, Hugo Valin mettait en évidence, et puis ça a été aussi repris, la différence importante entre la nature de ce qui est soutenu aujourd'hui, mais parce que c'est hérité d'autres objectifs de la politique agricole, et que dans les objectifs du soutien de la politique agricole aujourd'hui, il n'y a pas explicitement dans les principaux instruments de soutien l'atténuation des émissions de gaz à effet de serre nettes. Par rapport à la temporalité, on pourrait se dire qu'il y a peut-être aussi une opportunité qui se fait grandissante avec le nécessaire renouvellement des générations en agriculture, qui pourrait peut-être permettre, dans une PAC ultérieure, d'utiliser précisément et de conditionner les installations en agriculture, les reprises de systèmes à des systèmes qui pourraient être compatibles avec les objectifs européens en matière de réduction des émissions nettes en agriculture. Et peut-être d'autres aussi, plus généralement au Green Deal, mais en tous les cas, ne serait-ce que pour ce qui nous autorise aujourd'hui. Enfin voilà, je lance ça, mais à vrai dire, là encore, beaucoup d'incertitudes sur l'équilibre politique européen et sa capacité à être ambitieux en la matière. Mais bon, là, après, ça dépasse le rôle de la science aussi sur ces questions. Je vais m'arrêter là parce qu'il y aurait plein d'autres choses à dire, mais je ne doute pas que les discussions vont poursuivre après cette journée. D'une façon plus générale, dans le cadre du programme FairCarboN, on est très heureux du lancement imminent de 2 nouveaux projets de recherche d'ampleur en sciences sociales qu'on a évoqués déjà aujourd'hui. ClimFAS, coordonné par Kamel Elouchi, et Préfalim, coordonné par Fabrice et Tillet, qui sont encore là, je crois, dans la salle. Oui, ils sont là, tous les deux. Donc, vous me corrigerez si je dis des bêtises, mais ils ne sont pas encore lancés. Mais dans la ligne directe avec ce qu'on a abordé aujourd'hui, le projet ClimFAS ambitionne de mesurer le potentiel d'atténuation du changement climatique du secteur agricole français sur la base de données et de modèles agroéconomiques, compte tenu de la mesure du coût, de l'efficacité des différentes mesures susceptibles d'être adoptées, mais aussi des obstacles qui dépassent la mesure économique et physique, des obstacles psychologiques, socio-économiques, juridiques, voire politiques, obstacles à franchir pour permettre la réalisation de ces mesures d'atténuation. Donc je pense qu'on aura avec ce projet un certain nombre d'éléments de réponse à des questions que nous avons effleurées aujourd'hui. Et le projet Préfalim se positionne quant à lui du côté plutôt de la demande des consommateurs et cherchera à étudier comment les changements de comportement et de préférences alimentaires sont susceptibles de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre du secteur agricole. Et le projet ambitionne de questionner la flexibilité des préférences des consommateurs, ce qui est, par rapport à la théorie classique de la demande, un enjeu et je dirais même un défi théorique et scientifique. Ces 2 projets contribueront très probablement à répondre à un certain nombre de questionnements posés aujourd'hui, à éclairer les décideurs publics sur l'intérêt, les limites, l'impact d'options politiques à prendre à l'échelle nationale, européenne, pour contribuer aux engagements de l'accord de Paris dans le secteur agricole et le secteur alimentaire. Pour clore cette journée, je voudrais remercier toutes les personnes qui ont rendu possible cette journée et se sont chargées de son organisation et qui ont vraiment fait ça super. On a super bien mangé, ce midi. On est accueillis de façon hyper confortable ici. Donc, bien sûr, toute l'équipe de FairCarboN, et en particulier Perrine et ses collègues, les partenaires qui, au-delà de FairCarboN, ont donné un coup de pouce, notamment pour la pause de ce matin, c'est-à-dire la Graduate School Biosphera. Merci pour la tenue de cette journée. Et à toutes les personnes qui ont pris la peine de se déplacer, de se lever tôt, de prendre du temps pour prendre part à cette journée qui, on l'espère, est la première d'un cycle, puisque nous vous donnons rendez-vous à une date qui reste à préciser, en un lieu qui pourrait probablement être Rennes, pour une deuxième journée qu'on pourrait peut-être baptiser l'économie du FairCarboN, à une date qu'on vous indiquera prochainement, pour construire les échanges et sur la base de la journée d'aujourd'hui, voir comment déplacer le curseur pour aborder des questions qui élargiront le spectre ou au contraire approfondiront certains aspects. Ça, ce sera le travail qu'on aura à faire d'ici là. En attendant, je me joins à toute l'équipe de FairCarboN pour vous souhaiter une excellente soirée, un bon retour et bonne continuation à tous vos projets.